March 15, 2019. Frank Garrison had been searching for his daughter for 23 years. The horse chained to the oak tree was about to end that search forever. The thoroughbred was 3 days from death when Frank found her, ribs showing, eyes hollow. But it was the brand on her flank that stopped his heart cold, a twisted serpent he'd seen only once before. The night Sarah disappeared, Frank's hands shook as he cut the chains. This wasn't coincidence. Someone wanted him to find this horse. Someone who knew exactly what that brand meant. What Frank discovered next would shatter everything he believed about his daughter's disappearance. The sheriff who'd led the investigation, the brother who'd held him while he cried, the man he'd trusted with his life, all lies. All connected to the horse that should have been buried with the truth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The chains hit the frozen ground with a sound like gunshots. Frank's breath came in sharp puffs as he knelt beside the mare, his arthritic knees protesting against the March cold. 23 years of searching, and the first real lead had literally been chained to a tree on his own land. The horse's breathing was shallow, labored. Frank had seen enough dying animals to know she had maybe 48 hours left. But first, he needed a closer look at that brand. He pulled out his phone's flashlight, hands still trembling. The twisted serpent mark was maybe 4 inches long, burned deep into the mare's right flank. The scar tissue was old, years old. Frank's memory dragged him back to that October night in 1996, when 17-year-old Sarah had stormed out after their fight about college. He'd been standing at the kitchen window watching her taillights disappear down the drive when he'd seen another vehicle parked by the main road, a horse trailer, and in the brief sweep of headlights, he'd caught a glimpse of this same mark on a horse being loaded inside. By the time he'd grabbed his boots and run outside, both vehicles were gone. Sarah's car was found 3 days later in the Animas River, but her body never was. The horse trailer became just another detail that led nowhere, filed away in the growing pile of dead ends that had consumed his life. Frank slipped his arms under the mare's neck and hindquarters. She was probably 1,000 pounds normally, but starvation had carved her down to maybe 700. Still too much for a 64-year-old man with a bad back, but Frank had moved dying horses before. You did what needed doing. The barn was 200 yards of frozen mud and stubborn patches of snow. Frank's boots slipped twice, nearly sending them both down, but he made it to the main stall as the mare's breathing grew more ragged. He'd converted the space into a makeshift veterinary unit years ago when money got too tight for regular vet calls. 4 stands, medical supplies, heated water lines, everything he needed to pull animals back from death's edge. As he worked, inserting the 4, checking vitals, wrapping her in heated blankets, Frank's mind kept circling back to the same impossible question: who had access to his land? The Garrison Ranch covered 8,000 acres of high desert and pine forest, but the tree where he'd found the mare sat barely a half-mile from his house. Someone had walked onto his property, chained a dying horse to his favorite oak tree, and walked away. Someone who wanted him to find her. The mare's pulse was thread-weak but steady. Frank had pulled horses back from worse, but barely. He adjusted the IV drip and settled into the folding chair he kept in the stall. This was the part that killed him. The waiting, the hoping, the slow crawl of hours that decided between life and death. His phone buzzed. Text message from Marcus. Haven't heard from you in a week. You eating actual food or just whiskey and regret? Swing by for dinner Sunday. Frank stared at the screen. Marcus Garrison had been sheriff of La Plata County for 31 years. He'd led Sarah's investigation personally, working 18-hour days for months, following every lead down every dead-end road. He'd held Frank together when the marriage fell apart, when the ranch started failing, when the whiskey became easier than sleeping. Marcus was the only family Frank had left. But Marcus also had access to every piece of evidence from Sarah's case. Every witness statement, every photograph, every detail about that horse trailer Frank had seen, including the description of the serpent brand that Frank had given him 23 years ago. Frank deleted the message without responding. The mare stirred, lifting her head slightly. Her eyes were clearer now, more focused. Frank reached out slowly, letting her smell his hand before touching her neck. Her coat was matted and filthy, but underneath the neglect, he could see she'd been magnificent once. Thoroughbred bloodlines, probably worth 6 figures in her prime. "Who do you belong to, girl?" he whispered. "And why did they want me to find you?" The wind picked up outside, rattling the barn doors and sending snow devils spinning across the ranch yard. Frank pulled his jacket tighter and settled back in his chair. The mare's breathing was stronger now, more regular. She might make it through the night. But Frank wasn't sure he wanted her to, because if this horse survived, if she recovered enough to tell her story, he had a terrible feeling that everything he'd believed about Sarah's disappearance was about to crumble. The investigation, the evidence, the years of failed searches, all of it filtered through Marcus, all of it potentially lies. Frank closed his eyes and listened to the mare's steady breathing, the sound mixing with wind and creaking wood and the distant howl of coyotes in the high country. Somewhere in that darkness, answers were waiting. But Frank was starting to suspect that some truths were worse than never knowing. The horse would live or die by morning. Either way, Frank's 23-year search was about to end. Frank woke to silence. The absence of the mare's labored breathing jolted him upright in the wooden chair, his neck screaming from hours bent at an unnatural angle. Dawn light filtered through the barn's grimy windows, painting everything in shades of amber and dust. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought she was gone. Then she lifted her head and looked at him with eyes that held something he hadn't seen the night before. Awareness. Recognition, maybe. The 4-bag hung nearly empty, and her breathing came deep and steady now, no longer the desperate gasps that had marked her journey back from death's threshold. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank whispered, his voice hoarse from the dry barn air. "You decided to stick around." The mare's ears swiveled toward him, and Frank felt something twist in his chest. It had been years since anything on this ranch had fought to live. The cattle were healthy enough, but they were products, not companions. Sarah's gelding had been the last horse he'd kept for anything other than work, and Frank had sold Thunder within a month of her disappearance. Looking at the animal had been like staring into an open wound. Frank checked the mare's vitals. Pulse stronger, temperature closer to normal, the dehydration receding as the IV fluids did their work. She'd need antibiotics, proper feed, weeks of careful monitoring. She'd need hope, something Frank had been running short on for decades. He walked to the barn's main door and pushed it open, letting the morning air wash over him. The Garrison Ranch spread out in all directions. Rolling pasture land that climbed toward the Animas River Valley, stands of ponderosa pine marking the irrigation ditches, and beyond it all, the San Juan Mountains rising like jagged teeth against the pale sky. 4 generations of Garrisons had worked this land, built something lasting from nothing but stubbornness and sweat. Frank was the last of them. No wife, no children, no grandkids to carry the name forward. Just 8,000 acres that would probably end up sold to developers when he died, turned into vacation homes for rich folks from Denver and California. The thought should have bothered him more than it did. 20 years ago it would have. But grief was a peculiar thing. It didn't just hollow out the parts of you that hurt. It carved away pieces you didn't even know mattered until they were gone. Ambition. Dreams. The simple faith that tomorrow might be better than today. Sarah had been his anchor to the future. Not because she would have inherited the ranch, she'd made it clear college was just her first step toward anywhere but here, but because she'd given his life weight, purpose, someone to protect, to worry about, to love so fiercely it scared him sometimes. The morning he'd taught her to rope cattle, she was 12 and determined to prove she could handle anything the boys in her class could. She'd practiced for 3 hours in the August heat, sweat streaming down her face, until she could drop a loop over a fence post at 20 feet. When she finally made the throw, she'd turned to him with a grin that could have powered the whole county. "Did you see that, Daddy? Did you see?" He had seen. He'd been watching every second, memorizing the moment because some part of him had known even then how quickly children grew up and moved away. What he hadn't known was how quickly they could simply vanish, leaving nothing but questions that multiplied like cancer cells, spreading through every corner of his life. Frank walked back to the mare's stall, and she nickered softly at his approach. The sound was so unexpected, so normal, that it nearly brought tears to his eyes. When had he last heard a horse welcome him home? "You're going to need a name," he said. running his hand along her neck. The matted hair would clean up, given time and care. Underneath the neglect, her conformation was exceptional. Long legs built for speed, a refined head that spoke of bloodlines worth more than Frank's annual income. Can't keep calling you girl if you're staying. The brand on her flank caught the morning light, the twisted serpent seeming to writhe in the shifting shadows. Frank had spent 23 years trying to forget that mark, but his memory had preserved every detail with brutal clarity. The curve of the tail, the triangular head, the way the lines seemed to move when you stared at them too long. Someone had wanted him to remember. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to deliver this particular horse to this particular spot on his land. The question wasn't whether it was connected to Sarah's disappearance. Frank was long past believing in coincidences of that magnitude. The question was, what came next? Outside, a pickup truck's engine rumbled up the drive, tires crunching over gravel and patches of ice. Frank glanced through the barn door and felt his stomach drop. Marcus's patrol unit, the morning sun reflecting off the windshield like a warning. His brother climbed out slowly, favoring his left knee, the one that had taken shrapnel in Vietnam and never quite healed right. At 67, Marcus still carried himself like the soldier he'd been, but 40 years of police work had carved deep lines around his eyes and turned his hair white as fresh snow. "Morning, Frank," Marcus called, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he'd perfected during decades of delivering bad news. "Thought I'd check on you since you didn't answer my text." Frank stepped out of the barn, positioning himself between Marcus and the mare's stall. Some instinct he couldn't name was screaming warnings, telling him to keep this discovery to himself until he understood what it meant. "I'm fine," Frank said. "Just busy with morning chores." Marcus's gaze swept the ranch yard, taking in details the way cops did, automatically, thoroughly, filing away information for later use. His eyes lingered on the barn entrance, and Frank wondered if 23 years of law enforcement had given his brother the ability to smell secrets. "You look tired," Marcus said. "You sleeping?" "Some." Frank forced his voice to stay level. "Coffee's on if you want some." Marcus studied him for a long moment, and Frank had the uncomfortable feeling of being interrogated without a single question being asked. Then his brother smiled, the same easy grin that had talked them out of trouble when they were boys, and nodded toward the house. "Coffee sounds good. Got some time before I need to be in town." As they walked toward the ranch house, Frank felt the weight of the mare's presence in the barn behind them. She was alive, recovering, and carrying answers that could destroy everything Frank thought he knew about the worst night of his life. The only question was whether those answers would destroy Marcus, too. They sat at Frank's kitchen table, the same scarred oak surface where Sarah had done homework and argued about curfews and planned the college escape that never came. Marcus cradled his coffee mug in both hands, steam rising between them like a barrier neither wanted to cross. "You sure you're all right?" Marcus asked. "You seem, I don't know, jumpy." Frank forced himself to meet his brother's eyes. "Just tired. You know how it is." But Marcus didn't look convinced. His cop instincts were firing on all cylinders, Frank could tell. The way his gaze kept drifting toward the barn, the careful questions about sleep and food, and whether Frank had seen anything unusual lately. 23 years of investigating crimes had taught Marcus to read the spaces between words, to spot the lies people told themselves as much as the ones they told others. "Been thinking about Sarah lately," Marcus said quietly, and Frank's coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips. "Anniversary's coming up next month. 23 years. I think about her every day." The truth slipped out before Frank could stop it, rawer than he'd intended. "I know you do." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Frank's face. "That's what worries me. Sometimes I think, hell, Frank, sometimes I think you're still out there searching, driving those back roads at night, checking the same spots over and over." Frank set down his coffee, his hands not quite steady. "Would that be so wrong?" "It would if you're not taking care of yourself. If you're chasing ghosts instead of living." The word ghosts hit Frank like a physical blow, because that's what the mare felt like, a specter from the past carrying messages from the dead. But she was real, breathing, healing in his barn while he sat here lying to the one person who'd stood by him through the worst years of his life. Marcus's radio crackled to life, dispatching units to a domestic disturbance on the south side of Durango. He reached for the volume, turning it down but not off. Even on his day off, Sheriff Marcus Garrison was never really off duty. "Remember when we were kids," Marcus said, "and you found that injured hawk up in Miller's Canyon? You spent 3 weeks nursing that bird back to health, feeding it mice you caught in the barn, building it a recovery pen out of chicken wire and determination." Frank remembered. The hawk had taken weeks to trust him, longer to heal. When it finally flew away, Frank had felt something between pride and heartbreak, the peculiar ache of loving something enough to let it go. "You always had a gift with hurt things," Marcus continued. "Animals, people. Even me after I came back from Nam all messed up and angry. You never pushed, never tried to fix me, just stayed close until I found my way back." The kitchen fell silent except for the old refrigerator's hum and the distant lowing of cattle in the far pasture. Frank felt the weight of his brother's gratitude, the unspoken bond that had held them together through decades of shared grief. Marcus had lost Sarah too, not as a father, but as an uncle who'd taught her to drive his patrol car around empty parking lots and shown her how to throw a proper punch when Tommy Rodriguez kept pulling her pigtails in 8th grade. Marcus's phone rang, the harsh electronic tone shattering the moment. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "Sorry, I need to take this. It's the county attorney." Frank nodded, grateful for the interruption. He needed time to think, to figure out how much truth he could handle and how much he should share. But as Marcus stepped onto the front porch, his voice dropping to the careful monotone he used for official business, Frank caught fragments of the conversation through the screen door. "Cold case review, state requirements, 25-year mark." Frank's blood turned to ice water. "Sarah Garrison file. Yes, 1996. I know it's difficult." The coffee mug slipped from Frank's nerveless fingers, ceramic exploding against the kitchen floor in a shower of brown liquid and white fragments. Through the screen door he could see Marcus pause, glancing back toward the house. "Complete file audit. Federal guidelines, I understand. No, I'll handle it personally." Frank knelt among the broken ceramic, his hands shaking as he gathered the pieces. A cold case review. 25 years was the federal requirement for reviewing unsolved disappearances. He knew that much from watching cop shows. But the timing felt like a cosmic joke. The mayor arrives carrying her serpent brand, and now the government wanted to dig through Sarah's case files with fresh eyes. Marcus ended the call and stepped back inside, taking in the broken mug and Frank's pale face with obvious concern. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." There was that word again. Ghost. Frank straightened slowly, ceramic shards biting into his palm. What was that about? Marcus hesitated, and in that pause, Frank felt his world shift on its axis. Because his brother's face held something Frank had never seen there before when it came to Sarah's case. Guilt. "Just routine bureaucracy," Marcus said finally, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. "State mandates a review of all unsolved cases after 25 years. Sarah's file comes up next month." Frank's palm throbbed where the ceramic had cut him, blood seeping between his fingers. He wrapped his hand in a dish towel, buying time while his mind raced. What kind of review? External investigators. Fresh eyes on old evidence. Marcus moved toward him, reaching for the first aid kit above the sink, but Frank stepped back instinctively. The motion put distance between them, but it also revealed something that made Marcus pause. Fear. Raw, undisguised fear in Frank's eyes. "Frank, what's going on? And don't tell me it's nothing. I've known you for 64 years. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Frank felt trapped between the truth and the lies, between the brother who'd held him together and the cop who'd controlled every piece of information about Sarah's disappearance. The mayor's presence in the barn seemed to pulse behind him, a secret that grew heavier with each passing second. "I need some air," Frank muttered, pushing past Marcus toward the door. "Frank, wait." But Frank was already outside, his boots crunching across the frost-brittle grass toward the barn. He could hear Marcus following, could feel those sharp cop instincts focusing on his back like crosshairs. Every step felt like a betrayal of something, though he couldn't say what. The barn door creaked as he pulled it open, and Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. The mare stood in her stall, head lifted, ears forward, alert and alive and impossible to explain away. Frank heard Marcus's footsteps stop just behind him. Jesus Christ. Marcus's voice came out strangled, barely a whisper. Where did she come from? Frank turned to study his brother's face, searching for answers in the play of emotions there. Shock, yes, but was there recognition? Marcus stared at the mare like he was seeing a ghost, his weathered features gone pale beneath his winter tan. Found her yesterday, Frank said carefully. Chained to the oak tree out in the north pasture, half dead from starvation. Marcus stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was approaching a crime scene. His eyes swept over the mare's condition, the IV setup, the careful medical attention she'd received. When his gaze landed on the brand, Frank watched his brother's face go rigid. That mark, Marcus said, his voice barely audible. Frank, that's... I know what it is. Frank's words came out harder than he'd intended. Same brand I described to you 23 years ago, the one from the horse trailer that night. Marcus went very still. Not the stillness of surprise, but something deeper, the frozen paralysis of a man whose carefully constructed world was cracking apart. Frank had seen that look before, on suspects who knew they'd been caught, who were calculating how much truth they could afford to tell. Marcus. Frank's voice carried a warning now, the tone he'd use with a spooked animal or a man holding a loaded gun. I need you to tell me exactly what you're thinking right now. But instead of answering, Marcus pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. Frank watched his brother's thumb hover over the screen, saw him start to dial, then stop. Start again. Stop. Who are you calling? Frank asked. Marcus looked up, and Frank saw something in his brother's eyes that made his blood turn to slush. It wasn't just fear or confusion. It was the look of a man who'd been expecting this moment for 23 years, who'd been dreading it and preparing for it and hoping it would never come. I have to make some calls, Marcus said, his voice hoarse. This changes everything. Changes what? Frank stepped between Marcus and the barn door, blocking his exit. What aren't you telling me? Marcus shook his head, backing toward the door with the jerky movements of a man fighting panic. I can't, not yet. I need to think. I need to figure out how to... He stopped himself, but the unfinished sentence hung between them like a noose. How to what? How to explain? How to cover up? How to contain the damage? Frank felt something fundamental shift inside him, some last vestige of trust crumbling like old mortar. Marcus, I need you to look me in the eye and tell me you had nothing to do with Sarah's disappearance. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the mare's quiet breathing and the distant sound of wind through pine branches. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. But no words came, and in that terrible pregnant pause, Frank finally understood why someone had wanted him to find the horse, why she'd been left on his land, bearing that specific brand at this specific time. Someone was tired of keeping secrets. Someone wanted the truth to finally surface.